And we begin with the Supreme Court, which is beginning its new term with a case that could further open the door to unlimited money in American elections. The case is McCutcheon versus the Federal Elections Commission, with McCutcheon arguing that limits on how much an individual can spend in total donating to political campaigns every 2 years is a restriction on his First Amendment rights to free speech. Currently, the FEC regulates just how much money can be directly handed over to political candidates. Every 2 years, you can only give, at most, $2,600 to any one political candidate. And you can only give, at most, $32,400 to any one national party committee. Limits also exist on aggregate contributions, limiting an individual from donating more than $48,600 to the totality of candidates he or she supports, and $74,600 to the totality of party committees that he or she supports. That means the Federal Elections Commission limits what an individual can spend every 2 years contributing directly to elections to $123,200. That is the important number right there, and the issue that the Supreme Court is taking up, as Sean McCutcheon, an Alabama businessman and frequent Republican Party donor, argues that he should be able to spend as much money as he likes, donating to as many candidates as he likes during the election season. Again, McCutcheon isn't challenging the base limit he can give to one candidate, which is a total of $2,600, but the limit he can give to all candidates and national committees of $123,200. However, the conservative Supreme Court justices in this case, who've been growing more and more skeptical of any sort of limits on money in elections, could rule on the case far more broadly and strike down those $2,600 individual limits too. That's because Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's lawyer, who is also making oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court today, wants to strike down all limits on all campaign contributions. And as we saw in 2010's Citizens United decision, the High Court hasn't backed away from taking a narrow court case and issuing a much broader ruling with significant changes to current electoral law. So how might all of this shake out, and what are the political implications of this McCutcheon case? Well, I'm joined in studio here by Liz Kennedy, counsel for Demos, and from Massachusetts by Dr. Jill Stein, the 2012 Green Party presidential candidate. Dr. Stein, I'll get with you in just a moment and talk about kind of the political implications here, Liz, but I want to start with you and talk about this court case. Where does it fit in kind of the series of election law court cases we've recently heard by the Supreme Court, and what direction might the court be leaning here?
Sure, Sam. Well, this is a very important issue for folks to understand, but it is also somewhat complicated, or can be. The important thing to remember is that the Supreme Court has never struck down a federal contribution limit. In fact, the establishment of our current campaign finance jurisprudence, the foundational case, was Buckley v. Valeo, wherein the court decided that spending limits put too much of a burden on core political speech, and therefore spending limits, an actual cap on how much anyone can spend in an election of their own money on their own independent speech. They said that that could not be capped. That was essentially the decision in Citizens United, saying that where Justice Kennedy found that independent spending wasn't corrupting, which is something that we can come back to. But however, they have never cast doubt on the importance of contribution limits guarding the financial relationships between big donors and their actual checks directly to candidates or their campaign committees or the political parties. Because the court has understood that those kind of financial relationships are far more open to real corruption concerns. Moreover, it is not the direct political speech. It is actually just associational speech, or being able, when you contribute to someone else's campaign or to give someone money so that they can then fund their own speech, that is less of a core political speech question, and therefore the government has more power to regulate within that sphere.
Well, but the interesting thing here is now that with Citizens United, it's struck down the limits on, you can't directly hand money to a candidate, but you can spend unlimited amount of money campaigning on behalf of that candidate with TV ads and radio ads and so forth. So would it matter much at this point if you then go and strike down the individual limits that you can directly hand money to a candidate?
It absolutely would. And this is a question that was debated in the court this morning. But Justice Kagan made a very strong point saying if the court is now thinking that suddenly independent expenditures actually can be corrupting, then they should recognize that the government ought to have power to put in place common sense rules to protect our politics and our government from being captured by private economic power. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here, and that's what the court has always recognized. Even when they cut back on our ability to have these particular rules, they've understood that regulating in this sphere is important because otherwise what you see is a throwback to the robber baron era or even the Watergate era. Watergate itself was premised on campaign contributions, quid pro quo political favors. The milk industry easily, very clearly, it's in the record in the Watergate legislative hearings, gave money in order to get a price favor on milk subsidies. So this is the kind of bad democracy that we don't want to go back to, that exists too often elsewhere, too much big money elsewhere, but we need to maintain the kind of protections that we currently have.
Gotcha. I want to bring up these two charts here now, and they kind of show the breakdown in the individuals who met these contribution limits here. The first is to contributions to individual candidates, and the second is contributions to party committees. And in both cases, the individuals primarily donated to the Republican Party. Dr. Stein, I want to bring you in on this now. You have run for elections in this post-Citizens United world. You ran for president last year. How difficult is it for parties and candidates who aren't in corporate America's good graces to compete now, let alone if this McCutcheon case blows the doors off all contribution limits?
Yeah. I think, from the point of view of independent politics, this makes it only much harder. It goes from the frying pan into the fire. But that said, it's very difficult right now. It's been extremely difficult for a long time. The key here is not so much what's happening to candidates, I think, as what's happening to the American people. Because as alternative candidates are muzzled and silenced and kept out of the media, kept off the ballot, and basically blocked by this big money system and its many manifestations, it's not just the candidates, but it's voters who are losing because what we're left with are two parties that are just different around the edges. People are extremely, angry isn't the word for it, not only with the Supreme Court and with Congress and with this dismantling of the protections of our campaign system that was put in place after Watergate, as Liz alluded to. People want those protections kept in place. They want them improved. And are very happy with everything, very unhappy with everything from the stalemate on the budget, the shutdown, the threatened debt debacle with the default on the debt. Look at, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being rammed through the Congress right now. This is the kind of policies that we get because money in politics has basically won the day. The foxes are not just, running the chicken coop, they're devouring the chickens at the same time. And the American people are paying the price. 1 out of 2 in poverty, 39 million students in debt. We saw the studies out of recently out of, I believe, Stanford or Berkeley, actually, showing that 95% of all economic increases, all income benefits since the disaster of 2007 have gone to the 1%. Let me say that again, 95% of all benefits have gone to the 1%. And if you look at the economy as a whole, the top 1% has command of 50% of the wealth and the resources, while the bottom 50% has access to 1%. What's wrong with this picture? Money and the economic and political elite are basically ruling the day. But the American people are not being fooled, and I think that's what's hopeful, is that we need to exert pressure on the Supreme Court, on Congress, in our elections and out in the street. You know, fundamentally, that's how we're going to get out of this mess.
Gotcha. I think you brought it up an interesting point there, Dr. Stein, and I want to get your opinion here on this too, Liz, is that the way the American people view money in politics. In 2011, we saw the Occupy movement highlight this problem of money in politics. We see growing distrust of politicians and the corrupting influences you just talked about, Dr. Stein, and yet the Supreme Court appears to be going in the opposite direction. We had Citizens United and now the possibilities in this McCutcheon case. First, you, Dr. Stein, how do you explain this disconnect?
Yeah, well, I think they are logically responding to their masters, and by they, I mean particularly Congress, the White House, you know, and who makes the appointments to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court responds to them, but also to public pressure. And we've seen the Supreme Court turn around. We saw it in Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s, where the Supreme Court reversed itself after supporting segregation for decades. The Supreme Court suddenly began to support integration in the schools. You know, I think what we're seeing in the Supreme Court and in our elected officials are basically a reflection of the power of intensely concentrated economic and political power in the hands of the 1%, which is why we've got to fight this in every way possible. You know, I think it's important for people to weigh in with the Supreme Court, with their congressmen and women, and with the president, that this is unacceptable, that we cannot dismantle these protections in the same way that it is unacceptable to be holding the budget and the full faith and credit of the United States of America hostage here in what's basically an extortion game being played by the top 1%.
Gotcha. I want to bring Liz back in on this issue, but between this disconnect between what the American people view money in politics and how the Supreme Court seems to be ruling in these cases.
Well, Sam, I think that is a very good point, and I really want to respond to Dr. Stein and thank her for raising so many important points, because we do see 8 in 10 Americans saying that large campaign contributions are blocking important, necessary progress on critical issues that we face in this country, issues about upward mobility and more, you know, addressing our economic inequality, issues such as addressing climate change or cutting healthcare costs. And so the real issue here is the way in which the money in our elections actually plays out in our policy. 6 in 10 Americans thinking that their elected representatives are more responsive to their big donors than to voters or the public interest. That is simply not a situation for a healthy democracy. So what I would say is the Supreme Court, obviously the Supreme Court's role is to, interpret the Constitution and to determine what applying various balancing tests, make sure that constitutional rights are protected. That's critically important. The First Amendment is a pillar of our, structure of who we are as a people, and yet it is currently actually being just beyond its real true meaning is what we would say about the current interpretation, because what they're not understanding is the First Amendment rights of the people who are being drowned out of the system. Justice Ginsburg actually made this point.
We've got wealthy people getting more First Amendment rights than people who don't quite have some. But we have to move on to the next topic. Liz Kennedy, counsel for Demos, thank you so much for joining me.